This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's November 29th, 2021. I'm Ross John Fortune. According to estimates, about 20% of U.S. workers have fully returned to their offices. While vaccination rates are climbing, remote work is becoming the norm for more workers across the U.S., including for public sector workers. After all, the Biden administration has reiterated that hybrid and telework would be part of the federal landscape even after the COVID-19 crisis has abated. Agency leaders have had to learn how to work with remote employees since the pandemic forced everyone home in March of 2020. Our guest today has studied virtual work for over 2 decades and worked with agencies on remote work issues. Dr. Karen Sobel Lojeski is the founder and CEO of Virtual Distance International, an executive advisory firm specializing in workforce transformation. After a short break, she'll join me to discuss how feds are prepared for a remote and hybrid future. Want to hear more from GovExec, NextGov, Defense One, and Route 50? Tune in to our virtual events to hear interviews with government leaders about the most important topics today, including the federal workforce, health IT, artificial intelligence, 5G, and more. Visit govexec.com/events to learn more. Over the summer, the Biden administration sent a memo to agencies on the return to workplace processes, including endorsing maximum telework flexibilities to all current telework eligible employees. In the same memo, the administration suggested that agencies pursue hybrid work policies. Our guest today has studied virtual work for over 20 years and has worked with agencies on remote work issues. Dr. Karen Sobel Lojeski is the founder and CEO of Virtual Distance International, which is an executive advisory firm specializing in workplace transformation. She joins me now to discuss how feds are prepared for the remote and hybrid future. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Ross. Glad to be here.
So why did feds take to telework so well? How has the public sector been prepared as compared to the private sector?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question because it's been on my mind for quite some time. And I'll just give you a little story. A number of months ago, I realized that almost 100% of my clients right now are public sector clients. And this wasn't the first time that this actually happened. The first time this actually happened was when I discovered virtual distance and sort of brought it to market. And the first group or sector to come to me was the public sector. And as telework, hybrid work, remote work, et cetera, have been accelerating, so has my clientele in public sector. And I started wondering, is there a pattern here? Because it seems to me that this is telling me something. So I got very curious about this. And I started thinking about this a number of months ago. You know, I don't do much marketing and a lot of my work comes from word of mouth and things like that. So why is this showing up like this? Is there a pattern to be found? And I think there is. And I think there's a really strong and very important pattern to be found. And that pattern is, I actually think that public sector is much more prepared for this environment, but not only just more prepared, I think it's a better environment to carry this out. And I know this sounds completely counterintuitive to what the mainstream would say, but I really believe there are reasons for that. I mean, the first two are sort of obvious reasons, right? Private sector operates on, and I've worked in private sector, I've worked in public sector, I've worked in educational sectors and all kinds of things, and have loved all my work. But private sector operates obviously on profit and loss and has, an incentive to get products out the door as quickly as possible. And that's sort of what drives them. Public sector, on the other hand, has time to think. They actually like to think about critical problems. Not that private sector doesn't do that. They're just motivated by a different sort of approach. So public sector actually doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me that they are looking for ways to make this work well, because number one, they have the time to do it. And you need time actually for critical thinking. And you also need a history of critical thinking. You have to sort of be prepared to do that. And that's what the public sector is really in place to do, is to solve critical problems for people. And that's the ethos to me that seems to drive them. I know it does in my clients. So I actually think they're much more prepared and have their radar up for what could help them best before the private sector comes into play.
Well, I guess so. Let's dive into that a little bit. Like, how does that preparation kind of manifest? How do you see it from your clients, and what are those kind of conversations that you've had over this? I guess it's almost 20 months now, something like that.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. I mean, my clients have, a sense of urgency, obviously, to fix the problems that need to be solved right away. And actually, some of them were the best at coming together the quickest in virtual space and collaborating with one another to get, plans in place to address COVID, right? And this was happening at almost lightning speed in many ways. The public doesn't see a lot of this stuff going on, but it really was happening very, very quickly. The other thing was they were thoughtful. And when I say that, again, I don't mean that the private sector is not thoughtful. It's just that they were taking lessons learned from the past in terms of crisis management and crisis management leadership. What would be the most helpful for the public in a situation like this? And they would think through those things step by step and then make the best choice that they could. A lot of times that works in their favor, because there's an old quote from Einstein that says, no problem can be solved with the same consciousness that created it, right? So public sector, to me, is in a very well-positioned spot to realize that, wait a minute, the stuff that was working before is not going to work now, right? So how do we step back, think about this, and then answer it with a different kind of consciousness?
To reference that consciousness, like, what does that mean going forward? You know what I mean? Like, the private sector can operate within fewer strictures to a certain extent, but there are more guardrails, I guess, on the public sector. So what should public sector employees be prepared for with regards to that consciousness and more generally the strictures that are put on them?
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up, because I've been thinking about that a lot, right? So people think of the public sector, rightly so, to some degrees, with these guardrails of, bureaucracy and, having to make rules sort of desk bound and doing, one thing after another, et cetera, and following rules and regulations. But what was interesting to me upon reflection is those rules and regulations were sort of put in place because of other things that had happened in the past, right? So it's not that we always have to look back at the past, but there's a quote from Shakespeare that says, past is prologue, right? In other words, it informs our thinking. In the private sector, past is like the past. I've heard a million times people say to me, Karen, that train has left the station, forget about it. But the problem with that thinking in my mind is the past informs our future, right? Again, there's another quote from a scientist who discovered vitamin C helps us. He won the Nobel Prize in 1937. And he said, great discoveries are based on accidents hitting a prepared mind. And in many ways, the public sector, it is a prepared mind. They've been doing this for a long time. And actually, they're almost sort of best seated at the edge of that discovery because they are sort of listening for that discovery. It's not conscious, right? But when you say, what can they do now? One of the things that I've thought about, Ross, is they can feel very confident that they are prepared. In other words, they can go to their job every day and they know they have the right tools and the right skills to meet what the public needs. And if they don't have the right skills and if they don't have what they need, there are processes and procedures to go get those skills, right? In a private sector, it's not that straight a line. And again, that can work in the private sector's favor under certain conditions. But under these conditions, that is actually not the kind of sort of rattling around that you want to be doing.
Yeah, I think there's something we've referenced on our show a lot, and something that I think we've all dealt with is that uncertainty and that sort of use the term rattling. I always think of the closed eyes, sort of in the dark kind of thing that the initial spring of 2020 change sort of created. Communication, I think, to that end is the crux of this in a lot of ways. You see a lot between managers and employees, the different forms of communication, whether that's on the phone or messaging or video calls. How can particularly public sector employees deal with the communication hurdles that have come with this remote work? I mean, we're 2 years in, people should be getting better now, but it's still often very difficult.
Yeah, it is. And that runs across the board. I mean, again, I think one thing the public sector has going for it moving into this conversation is that they stand on a platform of public good, right? So they're coming into it sort of preconditioned to have a conversation. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to build a panacea. There are issues here and so forth. But, the cement on which they stand is basically headed in that direction. But as far as having day-to-day communications, one of the things that goes away first and foremost in this type of communication is context. I come to this sofa or this chair at my desk, you're coming in through wherever you're sitting, and you can see the bookshelves and stuff behind me, but you don't see all of who I am coming to this. You might know something about me because you do some research, but you don't know who Karen is, right? You don't know who this person is. And communication rests on this notion of shared context and then exchanging information. And that's how you get to shared meaning. But in this type of communication, we cut off all the context. And not only do we cut off the context, we start making assumptions. We start telling ourselves stories about what the context is for other people. And that's not on purpose. It's not a bad thing. It's just what we do. It's called same as me bias in psychology, right? So what public sector folks can do, as well as everyone, is to start opening that aperture a little bit. In other words, before immediately answering a question, for example, ask a question that will give you a little bit more information about how this person thinks, how they might feel about things. And I'm not talking about personal questions like, how many kids do you have? Because that's a little bit intrusive in a way. But you can ask questions about things like, what kind of professional background do you have? Or where did you go to school? Or you can even be more direct. You can say, we don't really know each other, or what we're stressed out with today, what's the best way for me to talk to you? How do you like to be communicated to? Is it best to call you at this hour or that hour? Do you like when chat is on, or is that too distracting? We tend to assume that we know these things, and it's unconscious, right? Again, it's nobody's fault. It's just an unconscious thing. But we actually have to make our context more explicit in a virtual world because we don't have all the richness of being face to face to give us the signals we need to kind of interpret that.
Yeah, we've all dealt with that in some way over these over this quarantine period. I know I have with people I work with, sort of broadly. So let's sort of end on the bird's eye view. It's been a long time. Basically, the maximum telework edict came out in March of 2020 from OMB. How is the public sector going to approach remote work in the future? Are we looking at the new normal? Is hybrid the new normal? Is it still unwritten?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question to end on. And I would say, again, something that may sound counterintuitive, but I don't think there is a normal. I mean, if you look over long periods of time, right, everything is always changing. And I don't like that cliche, well, everything's changing, because it feels a little bit like a cop-out. But the bottom line is, there is really no normal. Actually, if you look at the most steady thing there is to look at, it's how people relate to one another. That's actually stays pretty steady. We care about that we're interdependent, that we share a common future and fate, that we value the same kinds of things in our life, in our work, and other things. That stays actually very stable. So if we can stay aware, raise the level of awareness of what we actually have in common as normal, right? Even though our situation is changing around us. And in the public sector, we lean on our tendency for public good and mission-driven stuff. We have the time to do critical thinking, and we can bring to bear a thought process that is very difficult sometimes to reach in the private sector. Then I think those things put together give us the answer. If we can just let go of this idea there has to be a normal, and instead say we're the normal. And regardless, and it sounds kind of trite, but it's just true, whether we're hybrid work, whether we're remote work, whether we're sitting in an office, I'm still me and you're still you.
That's certainly, I think, a good way to approach it, and something hopefully our listeners will take to heart, and I know I will as well. Dr. Sobel Lojeski, thanks for being on the show with us.
Well, thank you so much, Ross. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortuna. We want to thank Dr. Karen Sobel Lojeski for joining the show. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dance. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.